Well, this has been an interesting day. I'm Pete Boardman and I'm recording this webinar for the FSC BioLinks project. This is now the third attempt to record this today. The first one was supposed to be a live webinar, but unfortunately I had broadband issues at my end and we had to abandon the recording pretty much at the beginning. That's not happened to me before, but I'm not too worried about it because I'd rather it happen to me rather than somebody delivering their maiden talk, which would be really awful. So thanks for joining me, albeit in a delayed way. The second attempt at recording this webinar also ended in failure. I recorded it through my PowerPoint presentation, and it got right to the end and then crashed and didn't save the recording. So we'll have a go for the third time, and hopefully it's third time lucky. Right, so my name's Pete Boardman and I currently work for a team within Natural England concentrating upon citizen science, though I've been involved in professional entomology for around 20 years or more. I used to work for the FSC between 2006 and 2015, and I ran several biodiversity projects there, including an entomological project called the Invertebrate Challenge, which worked with people to learn the skills needed to become expert entomologists studying flies, bees, beetles, bugs, and/or spiders. During my time at FSC, I authored 2 Shropshire County atlases, one on crane flies and another on shield bugs, and I also commissioned atlases by other people on Aculeate Hymenoptera and Microlepidoptera. I set up the Shropshire Springtail recording scheme and founded the Shropshire Entomology newsletter, which is still going to this day. Just around the time that I left the FSC, I found a springtail that was new to the UK in 2016, which was exciting. I later joined Natural England as a field entomologist and worked in the Natural England field unit up until very recently when I came back into citizen science. In 2020, I published 23 new species of craneflies to science from Cameroon, following a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship, and 1 new species more recently from Corsica. So that's a brief introduction to myself. Okay, so today we're going to look at protected invertebrate species in the UK. We'll look at the history of the legislation. We'll look at UK BAP and Section 41 invertebrates. We'll look at the IUCN Red listing process for invertebrates and how that impacts on protected species. And we'll end with a very brief discussion about what rare species of invertebrates have on, if they occur on your site, and what are the implications. Okay, so the protected invertebrates in the UK are a brief history. The first bit of modern legislation was the Conservation of Wild Creatures and Wild Plants Act, which became law in 1975. Only one insect was protected under that act, which was the large blue butterfly. We'll come back to that later. But this was later joined by the Essex emerald moth in 1979. That act was then superseded by the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. However, it wasn't until September 82 that any further invertebrates were added. They were 13 species of insect, a couple of species of spider, and a snail. They gained protection so that under that act it was illegal to take, to kill, or to sell any of those species unless subject to a license. Possession of any of those named species was also illegal unless possession had occurred prior to the Act. The species listed under Schedule 5 initially were the Norfolk hawker, the warp-biter grasshopper, the field cricket, the mole cricket, the checkered skipper butterfly, the swallowtail, the large blue, the heath fritillary, the New Forest burnet moth, the Barbary carpet, the black-veined moth, the reddish buff moth, and the rainbow leaf beetle. Spiders included in that list were the fen raft spider and the ladybird spider, and also the glutinous snail was added. A review of the Act later added 22 species of butterfly to prevent sale except under licence, and the checkered skipper was removed from the full protection list. A couple of species on that list. On the left hand side, the warp-biter cricket, that occurs at 5 or occurs on 5 sites in Sussex, Kent and Wiltshire on south-facing calcareous grassland or downland. And then on the right hand side, the Barbary carpet moth with its food plant barberry underneath. There are 12 known populations of the Barbary carpet. There's been a lot of conservation work has been undertaken by Butterfly Conservation, and they've planted 4,110 barberry plants, and larvae have been found from 9 sites in 2020, so it's an ongoing conservation success story. This is the rainbow leaf beetle, not a species I was familiar with before this talk, Chrysalina cerealis. Beautiful species, as you can see. It could be confused with Chrysalina americana, which is found on rosemary and lavender, but this particular species, the rainbow leaf beetle, only occurs from Snowdon and surrounds in montane grassland, where it feeds on wild thyme. So in 1988, a further suite of species were added to the list, including the Viper's bugloss moth, which was subsequently removed as it's considered extinct in 1998, the violet click beetle, more of which later, the New Forest cicada, the medicinal leech and the fairy shrimp. Then a year later, the high brown fritillary, the large copper and the marsh fritillary were all given stronger protection under the Act. Then in 1992, a number of beetles were added, including the lesser silver water beetle, and the Sussex emerald moth was also added. In terms of violet click beetle, this is a species that breeds in decaying wood, one of our saproxylic species. They only breed in the hollows of ash and beech where the heartwood is undisturbed and has decayed into a black mulch. It's only been found in 3 sites in the UK, Windsor Great Park, Bredon Hill in Worcestershire and Dixton Wood in Gloucestershire. I'm pleased to announce that it was refound at Bredon Hill the week before last by a team from Natural England. In 1998, the fiery clearwing moth and the Fisher's estuarine moth, more of which later, were added alongside the southern damselfly, and there was an update to the legislation regarding the freshwater pearl mussel, and also the greater stag beetle was banned from sale. So there's a constantly evolving bit of legislation when new species come onto the Act and some others are removed. Occasionally, very occasionally, people are prosecuted. In this particular case, Philip Cullen was ordered to carry out 250 hours of unpaid work and given a 6-month suspended jail sentence after illegally capturing and killing specimens of the large blue from 2 sites in the Cotswolds. Personally, I'd have increased the sentence to 500 hours for the criminal activity of wearing a shirt like that over another shirt and tie, but that's my choice and not the judge on the day. In the mid-1990s, there was a move to embed UK national law and EC law together under the Habitats Directive. Those regulations came into force on the 30th of October 1994, and then in 2010 the Conservation of Habitats and Species regulations came into force, which consolidated all the various amendments made to previous legislation in respect of England and Wales. When we left the European Union, we retained the EC Habitats Directive outcomes, and they are enshrined now in UK law. But under Annex 4 of the Habitats Directive, there were two species that were listed, the large blue butterfly and the aforementioned Fisher's estuarine moth. You can see on the right hand side of the presentation the life cycle of the large blue. They interact with red ant species, Myrmica sabuleti and Myrmica scabrinoidis. Apparently sabuleti is far more successful in interacting with the caterpillars, and probably less well known is the life cycle of the Fisher's estuarine moth, which is an incredibly fussy beast. So the moth is reliant upon areas of rough grassland where hog's fennel, its sole larval food plant, grow. Long coarse grasses such as cocksfoot and couch and false oak grass also are required to fulfill the moth's egg laying requirements. The optimum habitat for the moth is where there's an abundance of both hog's fennel and long coarse grasses, but the density of hog's fennel across a site is important, and it mustn't be too high, as it will prevent there being the required abundance of grasses for egg laying, or too low, as this will reduce the success of freshly hatched larvae migrating to a hog's fennel plant. So the most favourable density is one hog's fennel plant per metre squared. Incredibly fussy. So a conservation programme has been in operation in Essex and Kent since 2006 that aims to create a landscape scale network of sites for the moth that are secure from threats of flooding. There have been over 25 new areas of habitat for the species created under this programme to date, the majority through a bespoke programme set up under the higher level stewardship scheme. And the good news is signs of Fisher's estuarine moth larval feeding have been recorded at the majority of these new areas of habitat. And so I think we can say that the conservation programme has been very successful, which is great news. Here are the two areas involved. On the left hand side, the boundary of the Essex target area runs from Felixstowe down to Malden, includes sort of Clacton and Mersey Island, those sorts of areas. And then in Kent it runs from more or less Sittingbourne to more or less Margate. We'll talk now about the UK BAP and Section 41 lists. So the UK Biodiversity Action Plan between 1992 and 2012 was published in 1994 and was the UK government's response to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which the UK signed up to in 1992 in Rio. The Convention of Biological Diversity called for the development and enforcement of national strategies and associated action plans to identify, conserve and protect existing biological diversity and enhance it wherever possible. I think those of us who were around at the time will recognise that this was a golden age where money suddenly became available in counties and nationally to do lots of work on priority species. And I wonder whether we'll ever see those times again. So the BAP list, in terms of the species list, was made up of 360 species of invertebrate that ranged across crustaceans and millipedes and centipedes, spiders, wasps, stoneflies, moths, mayflies, grasshoppers and crickets, flies, dragonflies and damselflies, caddisflies, including the one on the front page of this presentation, the window sedge caddisfly, which is called Hagenella clathrata, 23 butterflies, 10 bugs, 75 beetles, 17 bees and 7 ants. But most of these species were without legal protection per se, but the list did include the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 protected species, and so as a whole they were taken into account in the planning system. Following the creation of the UK BAP and devolution in 1998, this led to the 4 countries of the UK developing their own country strategies for biodiversity and the environment, allowing conservation approaches to differ accordingly to the different environments and priorities within those countries. In 2007, however, a shared vision for the UK biodiversity conservation was adopted by the devolved administrations, and the UK government brought that together in a document called Conserving Biodiversity, the UK Approach. So the UK post-2010 Biodiversity Framework, published in July 2012, succeeded the UK BAP. The UK BAP lists of priority species and habitats remained, however, important and valuable reference sources. Notably, they've been used to draw up statutory lists of priority species and habitats in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, as required under Section 41 of the NERC Act 2006 in England, Section 7 of the Environment Act in Wales, Section 2, subsection 4 of the Nature Conservation Scotland Act, and Section 3, subsection 1 of the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act, Northern Ireland 2011. Rather than refer to all of these in the talk, I'll continue to refer to Section 41 and just take it as read that it's also reflected in those other documents across the other countries mentioned in that legislation. So the Section 41 list comprised of 378 terrestrial invertebrates, so up slightly from the BAP list, but very similar to it. Again, it contains legally protected species from the Wildlife and Countryside Act, but most are not legally protected per se. Again, Section 41 should be a consideration with planning, but as ever in this subject, that is only as good as the data that's available and the ecologists who are carrying out the survey work and also the time of year they're carrying that work out. Here are 4 Section 41 species: the royal splinter cranefly, the cliff mason bee, the heath bee fly, and the northern June tiger beetle. At this stage in the presentation, there was a plan to introduce a couple of polls, and it's very likely that Kieran and an associated team will still be able to do that. So I'll ask the questions in case that's a possibility, and I'll give certainly the answer to the first poll at the end of this presentation. So we have the royal splinter, the cliff mason bee, the heath bee fly, and the northern June tiger beetle, and the poll is: which is the rarest species? And that is using the records on the NBN, the National Biodiversity Network. The second poll is to ask which species of those four would most likely win a public poll in a Britain's Got Talent type of format. So which do we think the public would go for? Answers at the end. Okay, we will move on to red listing, the IUCN Red listing of invertebrates. So this process is managed by devolved nature conservation bodies, so Natural England, Nature Scot, Natural Resources Wales, etc., and the JNCC. So what do they analyse? Basically, it's about the threat of extinction. So using IUCN guidance, there are a number of different categories: extinct, critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, least concern, and if something isn't applicable, if it's a non-native species or it isn't looked at for whatever reason, it's given the not applicable criteria. Within Great Britain, we have two categories. We have the nationally rare species, which cover extinct down to near threatened, and we have nationally scarce as a category, which I'll explain a little bit more about in one of the slides coming up. And what we call species that are red listed fall into the category there of critically endangered, presumed extinct, critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. And so what do these criteria rely on? Well, they look at the population reduction where we know it. That applies to butterflies and a few other species. They look at the geographic range of most invertebrates that will be used. They look at the a potentially small population size and a decline. Again, butterflies mostly use this in assessment. We're looking at very small or restricted populations, which is probably the most popular of the criteria that we use in red listing invertebrates. In theory, we could use quantitative analysis if we had enough information, but we very, very rarely do to be able to use that method. So criteria D seems to be used most of the time alongside the geographic range criteria B. So in terms of what these threat status categories mean, for an invertebrate to be classed as critically endangered, it has to have a low area of occupancy, so in this case less than 10 square kilometres, and occur only on a single location, or if there's a species that's very, very rare and it's continuing to decline or has extreme fluctuations in its populations. To be endangered, it needs to be found in less than 500 square kilometres and be found on 2 to 5 locations. In terms of the vulnerable category, less than 2,000 square kilometres and have a location spread of 6 to 10. And then in terms of the near threatened category, again close to 2,000 square kilometres and occur between 11 and 15 locations. So what do we mean by locations? Well, most invertebrate recording that's done at a national level is done in a hectad scale, so a 10 kilometre by 10 kilometre scale. So whilst tetrads are the preferred method of looking at these criteria, most historic invertebrate recording has been done to hectad level nationally. So 11 to 15 hectads for near threatened, 6 to 10 hectads for vulnerable, 2 to 5 hectads to be endangered, or 1 hectad to be critically endangered. And of course, there could be more than one population within 1 hectad. We look at an example. This is the 10-spotted pot beetle, Cryptocephalus decimaculatus. It's a species that's been categorized as endangered. It's known from 3 historic sites. It's not been seen from Chartley moss in the last couple of decades, so potentially that population is lost unless it turns up again. There's some uncertainty about the Scottish population at the site it's known from, but it is known to be found still at Winbury Moss in Cheshire. I've seen it there on 2 occasions, 20 years apart, actually on the very same willow tree, which was quite amazing. But so the area of occupancy is estimated at 8 kilometres squares based on the chance that the Scottish population might still be there, and the Chartley one could potentially still be there, but probably not. So it's given 2 locations, and there's a decline in the area of occupancy and the number of locations if we consider the Chartley one lost. So should further work at the 2 sites where it hasn't been seen for a while continue, and then they are considered to be extinct from those sites and they just remain at Winbury, then it would be reassessed as critically endangered. In terms of GB rarity status, anything within 1 to 15 hectads is going to be considered as nationally rare, and then anything 16 to 100 considered as nationally scarce. And if we look at the 3 examples below, we can see the sort of full range there. Got the hazel pot beetle, Cryptocephalus coralli, known from 5 hectads, so it's considered to be nationally rare. The beetle in the centre, Acifia bipunctata, is known from 18 hectads, which means that it's nationally scarce. And then Cantharis pellucida is a pretty common species. It's known from 529 hectads and therefore doesn't have a rarity status, classed as least concern. Also, Acifia bipunctata would be classed as least concern as well within the IUCN criteria, but nationally scarce within the GB rarity status. So IUCN statuses are reported against in status reviews, and they look pretty much like this one. This is just a random one that I pulled from the internet. And here is an actual example of some text from a review of the Orthoptera, grasshoppers and crickets, an allied species of Great Britain, published in 2017. And you can see that in terms of the GB rarity status, species have been split into 2 criteria here. The nationally rare species, so they include the wartbiter, which we know from the Wildlife and Countryside Act in 1981, and the UK BAP and Section 41 lists. We have the mole cricket, again, Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981 and UK BAP and Section 41. Likewise, the field cricket. And then we have an interloper, the scaly cricket. Now, this species was mentioned in the Red Data book in 1987 as important, as Red Data book 1, but there was some doubt at the time as to whether it was actually a UK species. It was thought to be an introduced species from the Mediterranean. Subsequently, quite a bit of work has been done on it, and it has now been classified as a relict UK species, and we'll look at that shortly. There are 2 other species there: the large marsh grasshopper, which was put onto the UK BAP and Section 41 list, but not on the Wildlife and Countryside 1981 list, and the heath grasshopper, which has made its debut as nationally rare within this review. Then there are a number of nationally scarce species. The grey bush cricket, it's a species I encountered on the coastal cliffs around the south of England and the Isle of Wight. The bog bush cricket, a species of wet heath and bog, and there's a range of other creatures there, groundhoppers and grasshoppers and cockroaches and earwigs. They're classed as nationally scarce. If we look at a little bit more detail in terms of IUCN threat status, so the mole cricket is critically endangered, so it occurs from only one location, one hectare basically. The wart biter is classed as endangered. We know it's found on only 5 sites in Sussex, Kent and Wiltshire. So it occurs in 5 hectares and has an area of occupancy less than 500 kilometre squares. The vulnerable species there, the field cricket and the scaly cricket, have more populations across a bigger area, but still in no way common, less than 10 hectares. And the large marsh grasshopper and the heath grasshopper both come under the near threatened category, 11 to 15 hectares each, and round about 2,000 square kilometres of area of occupancy. So the scaly cricket that is classed as vulnerable, originally the species was only known from Chesil Beach, and it was assumed to have been introduced, but now we know that there are a couple of English populations and a Welsh population, and it also occurs on a number of the Channel Islands, Jersey, etc. And it's a species that appears to be expanding northwards, probably due to climate change. The heath grasshopper, which is listed as near threatened, it's restricted to protected heathland sites in Dorset and the New Forest only. All of its populations, therefore, are going to be on protected sites. I found it on a couple of occasions when I was doing work in Dorset Heaths, close to Wareham, and the habitat there in the photograph was very, very similar to the type of habitat I found it in. Combination of open heather with warm tracks. It seems to require that sort of habitat. There are a range of status reviews available for you to explore. I don't intend to read all of those out. I would draw your attention to hoverflies. I'll tell you why in a little while. But all of these publications will have species listed in GB rarity categories and IUCN status categories, and all will have a story behind them. Should all those species that are listed, that are identified, should they all be protected? That's an open question. If you want to get hold of the documentation, one source is the Access to Evidence website, which is a Natural England website, and that's the address there. The address is also in the links that I've supplied to Kieran, and that will somehow be attached to this talk. Also be aware that other agencies publish status reviews. This is the review of the scarce and threatened spiders of Great Britain. Species status number 22, produced by the British Arachnological Society alongside Natural Resources Wales. So they're not all published through Natural England or on the Natural England website. There are also a number of status reviews that are currently being worked on. The fungus gnats is being worked on by Peter Chandler. That's been being worked on for some time now, as has the cranefly status review that I've been working on alongside my colleagues in the cranefly recording scheme. Hopefully that won't be too far away now. It's currently being looked at within Natural England, and hopefully there'll be some movement on that shortly. There's a status review looking at the aculeate bees and wasps, which has been in production for some time. I think there's a little bit of a logjam with that one. And there's talk of a second hoverfly review, a repeat of the first one, which will be really interesting to see what movement there is on species. And there's also a review on weevils that's in preparation at the moment. There are some barriers to accurate and comparable information when putting together status reviews, and that's because many of these rare species are rare and there just aren't the records of them. An example of this is the Sullington tiger cranefly, which has only ever been recorded 3 times in history from Sullington Heath in Sussex. It was first found in 1936 and then added to the UK list in 1937 as a new British species. It wasn't then seen again until 1980, and then it wasn't seen till 2001. It was looked for in 2017 and 2018 and again this year, but it hasn't been found. So is it extinct, or is it just very good at hiding for decades and then turning up? We just don't know. Would we be able to carry out a review for craneflies every decade? The answer is probably no. It's unlikely, because there just isn't the level of recording needed for rare species like the Sullington tiger cranefly. And also there would be a high cost to that. There are hundreds of species that might be red listed across all the different taxa, and it would cost thousands and thousands of pounds to find and report on them. Most of that work would probably need to be done by specialists who either know or understand the species and who could visit, or have the freedom to visit at the precise peak flight time of that species. Do I think this should happen? Yes, absolutely. I think it should happen. Do I think it will happen? Do I think funds will be made available for it to happen? Sadly, no, I don't. I hope I'm wrong. From the cranefly status review that's currently in preparation, I thought I'd talk a little bit about that. This is the smudge-winged conehorn cranefly, Ctenophora ornata. We class it as near threatened in our latest status review because of the number of sites, the number of hectads that it's now recorded from. In the Red Data Book back in 1987, it was classed as a Red Data Book 1 species, and only really known from the New Forest and Windsor Forest, but now it seems to have either expanded, or we've certainly come across more populations, and that's largely been down to moth trapping. It's a species that readily comes to light. It's quite hard to find during the day. People don't happen across them, but it does occur in moth traps. This particular picture here was from a moth trap this year, just slightly north of the New Forest. It would add a new hectad to the map on the right hand side, but you can also see farther north in England There's a dot within Sherwood Forest. It's turned up in Sherwood Forest in recent years. So we don't know whether it's turned up in recent years or it's been there for years and only just turned up at light, but certainly it's expanded its population in relation to previous knowledge, and so it becomes near threatened in our review. The other thing we've done in this review is included photographs of habitat where we have them alongside maps. And we've done that for the reason that it's unlikely that this status review will be repeated within a decade. It may be 20 years, maybe more. And so we wanted to leave some evidence for whoever comes and does this next time of where the sorts of habitats that these rare species are found in that very, very few people ever get to see. And so we've tried to do that as much as possible as we can where we know of the precise type of habitat location that's been photographed and shared. Knowledge is ongoing, and every number of years, there's 5 years ideally, there's a quinquennial review of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and the Act is updated, and there's one currently ongoing at the moment, QQR 7, and it has a timetable there. And so the data gathering process has just come to an end now. You can see there July 2021. There's currently an analysis going on amongst an interagency group, which will have JNCC at its heart. There'll be an engagement and consultation process starting in October this year and running to the end of the year. And then it'll be signed off after external peer review, be signed off by chief scientists and the joint committee in February next year. We already know that the lesser whirlpool ram's horn snail is going to be added to the protected species list, and we'll have to wait and see as to what happens. Finally, the question of, I have rare species of invertebrates on my site, what does it mean for me? So as we've seen, only a small number of species have absolute protection, and it's quite unlikely most of us will own land where these species are going to occur. Most species that are protected occur on sites that are also heavily protected, calcareous grassland or what have you, that are within the protected sites network. So it's not really going to apply to most of us. But having said that, there's absolutely potential for locally uncommon or nationally scarce species of invertebrates to occur on a whole range of sites. And in these days of climate crisis, I would maintain that every potential site for invertebrates is important these days and should be cherished and managed. But if you do have a site and you have something interesting on it, do share that information with recording schemes, with others, so that those records can go into the recording schemes, and the basis of the IUCN status reviews is records from recording schemes. So it's really, really important. If you do have a really rare species of invertebrate on your site, congratulations, I'm very, very envious. And do tell people about it. Unless it's a heavily protected species like large blue, most people probably won't be interested, and they probably won't want to come and steal it from your site. But it's a really wonderful situation to be in, to have rare species. I think before we finish, I need to go back to those polls. So the first poll, if you remember, was the photograph of the royal splinter crane fly, the heath bee fly, the northern June tiger beetle, and the cliff mason bee, and I asked which of those is the rarest species. The answer to that is the royal splinter crane fly. It's a critically endangered species that only occurs on one site in the UK. It occurs in a few trees in Windsor Forest, in Windsor Great Park. In second place is the cliff mason bee, Osmia xanthomelana, that has 210 records on the NBN and occurs in scattered coastal localities where there are slumping cliffs in North Wales and in England. In third place is the heath bee fly, 219 records from heathland sites in the south of England. And in third place in terms of records on the NBN, in fourth place in terms of records on the NBN, is the northern June tiger beetle that has 1,739 records, a lot of records compared to the others, but the actual locations are restricted to the Merseyside coast, and so whilst the beetle doesn't occur in a large geographic area, it has lots of records. The second poll was to ask which of those creatures would win a poll for in a Britain's Got Talent type style for the public, and I certainly think the heath bee fly would win. It's a cute little hairy teddy bear of a creature, but not necessarily the rarest of those. So that's something to consider. Rarity and looks. The final thing that I wanted to say was to hold a poll up now and ask the question: do you think invertebrates have enough protection in the UK? That would be a yes or no question, and I know which of those I would tick. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to stop this now and hope it has recorded. And thank you very much for joining me.